Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them.
This answer seems to be, oh gosh, we might have to get violent here, as opposed to learning how did Martin Luther King Jr. do it? How did Howard Thurman, who laid out kind of the theological basis for what became the civil rights movement in the United States. Like we need to go back and study our history to discover the right way to handle the moment that we're in.
My guest today is Elizabeth Neumann. She's Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot and also a contributor to ABC News. Previously, she worked at the Department of Homeland Security working on counterterrorism. Elizabeth Neumann, welcome to the ABC podcast.
Thanks for having me, Knapp.
All right. So we initially reached out to you after the Charlie Kirk murder to talk about political violence. There's been even more cases even since then to talk about. And just this past weekend, we had the incident at the Mormon church, which initial reports appear to be an act of political violence as well. I just want to share some data. There's been some new data that's come out as well. There was just this week, there was an NPR PBS Marist poll that found 3 in 10 people say that Americans may have to resort to violence to get the country back on track. And that's a huge increase from the previous poll that they did in March of 2024, where that number is 20%. So a 10-point increase in a little over a year. Most of that increase came from Democrats, who went from 12% to 28%. Mm-hmm. Republicans in that time went from 28% to 31%. Independents went from 18% to 25%. There was also a new study by Center for Violence Prevention at UC Davis. Their finding was 10% of respondents indicated they were somewhat willing to personally use force or violence to either support or oppose the government's enforcement of its policies. When asked if they were very or completely willing to commit violence, the numbers were 2.1% supported violence in support of the government, representing about 5.5 million adults. For violence in opposition to the government, the number was a little bit higher, 2.7%, or about 7.1 million adults. Then there was a study from Center for Strategic and International Studies. It says that halfway through 2025, attacks by far left extremists outpaced far right violence for the first time in more than 3 decades. And then there was a YouGov poll that found that younger and more liberal Americans were more likely than older or more conservative Americans to say political violence can sometimes be justified. Now, I know there's caveats with this. One is that political violence is still very low compared to certain other parts of the world. And historically in the U.S., of course, we had the spike with regard to 9/11, but compared to other types of crime, political violence remains low. Elizabeth, what is this? Is this data right? I mean, you've been looking close into this as well. What's going on with, in particular, left-wing violence compared to right-wing violence, and this increase? I know any single poll can be off. So, is anything going wrong here? I mean, or is this the trend that we're seeing?
Yeah. I'll start with, there have been a series of surveys, research, academic, rigorous surveys that have asked variations of this question really since 2020. There are a few that go back before then, but 2020 was clearly a year of unrest. And then you had the moment in January 6th that really alarmed many people. And so they started asking people about their willingness to commit acts of violence to achieve a political aim. And the polls vary from maybe the low point is like 15%, and the high watermark I've seen is 45%. And so generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that the answer is somewhere in the middle there. Usually you have some outlier surveys and research, and then somewhere in the middle. So there was a UC Davis poll last year that's been asking the same questions for about 3 years, and the latest numbers they had covered the period of last year, and that number was around 26%. So some of the polls that you're citing are asking the question a little bit differently, and so depending on how you frame your question, you're going to get slightly different answers. But it seems that in the country we have somewhere around a quarter of us to a third of us are like willing to use violence in certain circumstances to achieve whatever agenda that the framing of the question is around. So to preserve the country, to push back against an authoritarian government, there's an appetite among a quarter of us. That's a huge number. And one of the things we know about people who do eventually go commit acts of violence is it's a really small percentage. So just because you hold a belief system that violence is justified does not actually mean that you're going to go do something about it. But what we also know is when you have a population that has a large number of people that are open to violence as a solution, you do end up with more attacks. It's just math. So you have a small percentage of a small hole, you get a small number. A small percentage of a big hole, you get a much bigger number. So the larger the pool of people willing to say that violence is an option, the more attacks we're going to have. So this has been a trend for 4 or 5 years. And if you go back to look at just plots and attacks, we've been on an uptrend since 2015. So the starting point of seeing more violence occurs between 2015 and 2020. And then the starting point of the population starting to say, yeah, violence is okay, starts around 2020 and starts to increase. And so it's not surprising that between those two trend lines, the fact that we already were seeing increases in plots and attacks starting back in 2015, and then you have this catastrophic moment of COVID, which I don't think I think we're living through the consequences of COVID at the moment, but I don't think we can fully understand it. It's going to be the historians that are able to look back and say, this is what it did to us. We as a society we're just kind of broken, and we've decided nothing works, or at least a quarter of us have decided the institutions don't work, the systems don't work. And so therefore I've got to take matters into my own hands. So it is a fraught moment. It's also not new. And what I mean by that is we've been in it for about 5 years. But what we are starting to see that is different is what you highlighted in some of those research reports and polls, that you're starting to see a shift on the left, a willingness to accept violence as a solution. And that is showing up in the data in terms of plots and attacks. So CSIS, which is very reputable, I used their survey data in my books to explain the far right violence being pretty high in this country for the past 30 years, actually surpasses Salafi jihadist violent extremism, so ISIS, Al-Qaeda attacks, and far surpass far left. Far left violence tends to be focused on infrastructure, focusing on property crime. They don't target people usually. They do the counter-protest thing, which we saw in 2017 on college campuses, 2016, 2017. So the far left violence tends to be far less lethal and tends to not, tends to be very targeted towards very particular causes, whereas the far right is where you often see the mass attacks, the shooting at the Walmart, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the Buffalo grocery store in New York, even some of the more recent attacks. There has it's been more difficult to codify. Are they far right? Are they far left? And that's kind of the moment we're in. We still have far right committing attacks. We have a new surge of far left doing not necessarily mass attacks with an asterisk around assassinations. But it's not the same as what we see from the far right. And then there's this weird category in the middle that has been growing for 5 or 6 years. Back in 2019, 2020, Director Wray of the FBI called it salad bar extremism, where we were watching people spend time online and they would pick and choose conspiracy theories, and they would say, kind of build their own ideology. So that's been around for a while. And more recently, what we're finding is the ideologies are like really loose. Like everybody wants to know what's the manifesto. And then when you read some of these manifestos of late, like what happened at the Catholic school in Minnesota, I guess it's been a month now, that individual was a person with grievances, and everybody has grievances. So it was a grievance based, but then like hodgepodge of ideologies. And you start to realize it wasn't really any of those ideologies. This was just a very unhealthy kid that needed help and was suicidal. Like that is a pretty common feature of most attackers these days, is that they want to kill themselves anyway, but they want to do it to make some sort of statement. And increasingly, these attackers are nihilistic in their view of life. Like nothing matters. Everything's broken. And so there's accelerationism. I just want to usher in the end of the age, end of society, and nothing matters. And so I'm just going to go out in a blaze of glory. And it's really hard to categorize. Is that far right? Is that far left? It's kind of this new category for us that doesn't meet the ideological spectrum, but it's actually quite important for us to be focusing on this, because I think it's indicative of kind of where particularly our young people are, that they're feeling this hopeless, and that if we are seeing this again and again, like the first Trump assassination attempt falls into this category. The Catholic school shooting falls into this category. Possibly the Charlie Kirk attacker. He's definitely political violence. He was targeting Charlie because of the positions that he was taking, but they're also, when you start hearing some of the backstory, you're like, yeah, this is also a little bit nihilist extremism style, meaning I just don't see a purpose in life, and so I'm going to make a statement as I go out. And so there's like this subtext here that when we focus just on the left and the right, you're actually missing the deeper issue here. Is actually we have a lot of kids that have given up hope on life, and especially as believers, like that, we actually have great answers for that, and have hope to offer kids who are struggling. So it is important for us to acknowledge something has shifted on the left. I don't want to diminish that, but I also get nervous when we focus on the categories, the far left and the far right. We're missing the broader conversation of why are we having so many attacks? Like, it's a society that's not healthy. And why are so many people giving up hope and thinking that violence is the way out? Like, we need to not skip that part too.
Yeah, and I remember last July we were in Atlanta. You gave a speech to our conference in Atlanta, and ABC has always been. We were founded to address the problems of extremism on the right, but you told our audience there you were seeing signs that there could be an increase in left-wing political violence even back then, and now it's of course a big topic for this year in 2025. What has happened on the left to kind of, I understand what you're saying. It's not sometimes it's hard to categorize, that's important as well. But is there something happening on the left that we would see this shift that's happening?
Yeah, we as a field, we've been having the quiet conversations for a couple of years now, saying something shifted, and it's a bit like you're forecasting, right? Like we're picking up subtle changes in language, in grievances, in willingness that talks about like violence might be necessary. And you never know. Sometimes communities have to go through like a conversation and get to the other side, and then they're fine. And so, people trying to prevent violent extremism, when you see a shift in the way that a community is interacting, you kind of sit up and listen. Okay, this is not your norm. What is happening? And certainly when we started to see some of the assassinations of last year, the attacks on Trump, there were two. And then, there was the CEO, United Healthcare CEO assassination in December. And while that is not one that you can really categorize, it is an anti-institutionalism, anti-capitalism ideology of sorts. I'm applying a meaning to an attacker who has not said that. So I want to be careful. His stated reasons and the drivers behind them, as I've said ad nauseum, it's usually not the ideology that is actually driving somebody to kill someone. But if you had to categorize it, it's anti-capitalism, anti-institutionalism. And that has been on the rise. And then more importantly, the response to this attack, to see so many people applauding it, was rather jarring and alarming. That you have so many people who are just comfortable with like, yeah, life was taken, and you know what? He represented something bad, and it's okay. And I mean, it is so jarring to see what otherwise normal people that you're going to the grocery store with and hanging out at the soccer game, that are just willing to say like, yeah, it was totally okay for him to be killed. That probably for me was the moment that I was like, oh gosh, we've really broken ourselves at this stage. This is no longer just the extremists that spend a lot of time, indoctrinating themselves in certain, disgusting ideologies. It's not just the kids that are in gore sites. That's another key driver behind some of the shootings we've had lately. It's not just that. It's mainstream Americans who have been okay with the idea that taking a life is justified. So that to me is really alarming. And then when you move into the political cycle that we are in, where Trump won, and part of what I was talking about back in a year ago in Atlanta was we were already seeing conversations happening offline and online in the far left circles, kind of trying to figure out, is Trump going to win? And if Trump wins, maybe I need to go buy a firearm because I think the government's going to come for me. And in some ways, like, they're not wrong. Some of the things the government is doing is targeting political enemies. And so like, it's a weird thing to be having conversations and saying, yeah, violence is not the solution. And yet the government is being weaponized against people. The government is violating civil liberties. Multiple courts have said, you stepped out too far. You should not have done that. And so they're not wrong to be scared of their government. And when people are fearful and feel like they have no other choices, that's when you come to the conclusion violence might be necessary. So it's kind of a difficult spot outside of a faith context to advise people. Like in a faith context, we can point people to anchor their hope in Christ, that even if we're enduring persecution, that we know God will bring all things to good. I also think the courts are holding. I think the courts are doing very good things as a stopgap to push back against some of the abuse, but that doesn't mean you're not going to experience the abuse first, right? And so when you're a person of faith approaching it, you can anchor your response in, okay, Jesus was persecuted. He did not lash out. My answer is not violence. But if you don't have that moral anchoring, that faith anchoring in something bigger than the moment we're finding ourselves in, it's actually completely logical to think I've got to protect my family, right? Like it's not illogical to watch some of the abuses of authority that the government is carrying out and think maybe violence is justified. So that I am empathetic that there are people who are living in fear of the government. The African American population has throughout the Jim Crow South, in certain immigrant communities throughout our history, as well as Native Americans did. Actually, if you go back in our history, no, there's plenty of examples of the government abusing citizens or abusing its people who probably should have been citizens but weren't given that right. And I actually look to some of their examples as a place of hope for how to deal with this moment. We can also look around the globe at other examples of populations being abused by their government, and what do you do to stand up? How do you stand up in such a way that is appropriately standing for what is right and just, but also not doing it in a way that is violent? But we, as a country, really haven't had much experience. Certainly our generation really has not had much practice with this. So I can appreciate why this answer seems to be, oh gosh, we might have to get violent here, as opposed to learning how did Martin Luther King Jr. do it? How did Howard Thurman, who laid out kind of the theological basis for what became the civil rights movement in the United States. Like we need to go back and study our history to discover the right way to handle the moment that we're in. And I still think you can see the problem clearly. We do have a government that at times is abusing its authority, and we don't have to choose violence as a response. But I also appreciate that takes a lot of thought and conviction, and we as a citizenry really have just not had to exercise those muscles anytime recently. So I think that's why we are seeing that uptick of willingness to take up arms in order to protect what you feel like is under threat.
I think the secular hope is that there's always another election coming up. And so, put your hope, ballots, not bullets. That's where you look forward to the next election next year. So we have a year and 1 month. This is being recorded on October 3rd, 2025. The entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate is up for election. So there you go. Look forward to that. What's something like, is there anything that us as ordinary Americans can do, maybe especially our friends on the left, if you're seeing this increase, among, your people who share your political views, or just in general, what are some things we can do to try to help prevent or tamp down?
We can be people anchored in the hope of Christ, and from that be stability for people that might not have that anchor. I think practically mourning with people is really important. Being present with people as they are struggling with whatever it looks like for them. So I just earlier this week was at the National Immigration Forum. It's a number of different constituency groups, from businesses to law enforcement to evangelical Christians, that come together mostly to advocate for common sense immigration reform, but just to recognize that immigration is an important part of what makes America America. But if you're in the pro-immigration space right now, it's kind of a hard business. This administration is, I think it's fair to say, they're anti-immigrant, and in ways that are actually kind of economically stupid. And so being in a space with people who really, really care for their immigrant neighbor and feel powerless to help, watching raids happen, often unlawful raids, and just feeling like, how do you come alongside people who are, living in legitimate fear? And sometimes the answer is you're just present with them and you mourn with them. And I think especially as westernized Americans, we're used to action and solving problems. And this is one of those seasons where we can't fix this. This is something that is happening, will happen for the next 3 years. And you're absolutely right, Nap. There's an election in a year, and that can stem some of the worst of the actions. But the executive branch still has a lot of power to do things that they want to do. And so this is something we will be persevering through, not necessarily fixing. And I think I think it's an important faith step, right? That like sometimes we are in spaces that we don't get to fix, and we have to just walk through, and we hold each other's hands and find how can we encourage one another to just take that next step and do the next right thing. The other thing I have been that's been really like the Lord's been pressing on me the last couple of weeks is there's a danger in staying fixated on the macro, on the national picture. And I want to be cautious here. We do need to stay educated about what is happening, what the government is doing. We need to educate others about why it's unlawful or why it's immoral, because that will help with elections. Part of the reason we're in this mess is enough people didn't appreciate what they were voting for. So we do need to stay aware. And also, we need to stay focused on the things that God has called us to do in front of us, where you have agency, where you have influence. Because if we get so distracted, then we won't actually be faithful for the calling that we have, and that we're wasting time. We're in a long game here, and the fixes in our country that are needed are actually heart change fixes. It is voters that put Donald Trump into office, and voters who said, I don't care what you do, just get rid of these immigrants, or I don't care what you do, I just want my grocery prices to go down. And in my opinion, there were a lot of reasons, I should say. There are a lot of reasons people voted for Trump, and it wasn't just immigrants or lowering of grocery prices, but there were quite a few people who struggled, didn't want to vote for him, and felt like it can't be that bad. And I think there's a work to be done to persuade people that actually this democracy experiment is reliant on having an educated electorate that cares about the public policy that their legislature and that their executive is passing and implementing. And I think there's a misunderstanding of how government works. I talked to a lot of people before last year's election who were voting for Trump because they thought he would fix their local schools, or voting for Trump because of culture war issues. And there needs to be a better understanding of what the role of president is versus the role of your local school board or your state school board, and where culture even comes from, right? It isn't from the government. Government is downstream of culture. So there's like opportunities in this space, while we can't fix it, to educate, to inspire, to influence, and create communities that want a competent, ethical government, right? Like there's like we have lost so much faith in our government institutions, but the reality is we, the people, are the ones that elect them. So we have the ultimate power to fix this, but it does require leaving your house and meeting your neighbor. It does require being engaged. And I think from all of the research and the studies that I have reviewed, like that is not going to come out of Washington. It's going to come from our states. It's going to come from our cities. It's going to come from our churches who say, I want better. I don't want politicians to lie to me. I don't want government that seems like they can't do the basics. Like some of the incompetence that we are watching is just jaw-dropping. You would never take your child to a doctor who has not actually gone to medical school. We should not be hiring people in positions that require a level of knowledge and skill who don't have that knowledge and skill. And we currently have a government filled with people that don't have the knowledge, skills, or abilities to be entrusted with the public trust that they have been given right now. So I think there's much work to be done in this space. It just looks different, especially when we're used to big calls to action, like we're going to get this piece of legislation passed, and we're going to fix this problem. And for so many years, the arc of American history was things were getting better. And I think part of the nihilism, part of the hopelessness that people feel is like, it's not getting better right now, it's getting worse. And there's two ways to react to that. One is to give up. The other is, well, it doesn't always have to be this way. And I want to start doing the work to make it different for my kids and for my grandkids. But to do that, you can't say like, this is how I'm going to fix Washington. No, it's like, this is how I'm going to work in my community where God has placed me, with my skills, my knowledge, my abilities. And this is where we're going to have influence and where we're going to make change. So those would be my encouragements is we got to pay attention to the national picture, but don't stay there. Focus on the things that you do have agency over. And apply yourself to that, because that investment will bear fruit. It's a long term. This isn't gonna, 2029, I do think just the political course of history, usually the party in power loses. So I do think there's a good chance that we see a pendulum swing the other way. But the underlying reasons that we ended up with the choice of Trump and Biden or Trump and Harris in the first place, which nobody seemed to like, those underlying preconditions are still going to be there. We have to do the deep work of renewing our communities so that we then get leaders that we actually want to vote for.
I want to go back to something you said about the sort of salad bar ideologies of some of these shooters. It seems like now, like every time something like this happens, our response is so tribal. It's like immediately it's which team is the shooter on, or are they on my team or their team? And it's not just like, of course, it's like people just on Facebook, you're like speculating and that kind of stuff. But politicians, like you don't even know yet. You don't even have full information yet about the shooter. And they're already saying out there, putting ideas about, that's a Democrat shooter, or no, that's a Republican shooter. And of course, we've seen the Trump administration use this as an excuse to attack free speech and in other ways, claiming that there's, because of left-wing violence. So, how do we be responsible in how we, use our networks of influence, whenever we see a shooting happen, what's the best way to respond to that?
First is be mindful that especially the immediate aftermath of any incident, there's just a lot of bad information that comes out. It's a lot of speculation, especially on social media. One way that you can protect yourself is don't be on social media. Go to one of the mainstream news sources because they have standards. Standards means they have lawyers that are looking at the reporting information and giving an okay. Yes, you can report that. So there's a check on the reporters to make sure that they are, to the best of their knowledge, reporting accurate information. So yes, that means you're probably going to find out things maybe slightly slower than what you might see on X or Blue Sky. But that is a way to protect yourself from a bunch of stuff that most likely turns out not to be true, but you have no way of knowing because you have no way to go back and be like, well, was that true or not? So just stick to solid news sources who will correct the record if they're wrong. That would be the first thing, modeling that. for our communities, and not engaging in the speculation on social media. All of that's important. And then I think look, when communities are in mourning, and we particularly saw this after the Kirk assassination, it is a very human response to ask why. And that why has so many answers, right? It's, why God did you let this happen? It is why would this person do this act? And one of the ways the media and all of us try to answer the why question is by finding the stated motive of the attacker. And so there's always this run to look online to see what places they were spending time online. Did they leave a manifesto? Did they leave a video? And you're trying to like rack and stack it in your mind. Oh, this person didn't like Charlie for this reason. The thing that I would, especially leaders, have the opportunity to remind people is that the stated reason, the grievance, is really just kind of it's the moral justification for an individual that had a whole host of other things that, like, the actual drivers are not the stated reason. It's not that you hated ICE. It's not that you were concerned about how Charlie Kirk talked about transgender issues. It's somebody that's deeply broken. Now, I don't mean in a mental illness way. What we know about most attackers is that they don't present with a defined mental illness. Some do, but not disproportionately to the population, the general population. But what is true is if you're at the point where you're taking life, you are not mentally well, right? So things have happened in your life that, and you haven't had the necessary support to be able to deal with whatever has not gone well in your life. And then you get exposed to stuff online that suggests that this is the way to take care of your pain. So it's very tragic, and I'm cautious when I talk to a community that is a direct, indirect experience with a tragedy like this, that they're not ready to empathize with the victim or the attacker. And I want to say that out loud. If you are ministering to a community that's been attacked, you have a very different calling than those of us who are watching from the outside and who are still really upset by what has happened, but have enough distance to be able to see that, hey, labeling this person's ideology isn't actually going to solve this problem. And counting, whether it's more far left or more far right, or this mixed category that we can't define, that's not going to solve anything. What could solve things is we could do a better job of educating bystanders on what the signs and indicators are of somebody mobilizing to violence, because that's pretty well defined and documented now. And you could lead an effort in your community to train ministry leaders and church leaders, maybe even bring it to your schools and parents about what it looks like when somebody's in trouble and they need help. And by the way, if you can catch that early enough, you don't have to involve law enforcement. You can get that person help through a trained mental health professional. And I should clarify, it's not just your run-of-the-mill counselor. It is a specialized training to treat somebody who is on the pathway to violence. But there is a growing number of people who have been trained, and you can actually keep your community safe by educating yourself and by helping your broader community educate themselves and what it looks like when somebody is in trouble, and getting that person help. Coming from a place of love, we want the best for them. They're struggling, and we have the opportunity to help them choose a different path. And of course, if in engaging somebody and you can't move them off of this fixation, and you start to realize, no, that they're a danger to themselves or to others, of course you call law enforcement, and that is why we have law enforcement. But we can't solve this problem solely through law enforcement. We need the community to say, this is enough. We have way too many of these attacks, and people that are clearly not well, and we're not seeing them, and we need to see them and meet them where they are and get them help. So that's what my encouragement would be when we have these moments of attack and people are asking why. The answer to the why is actually not the ideology. It's these underlying psychological and social needs that have gone unmet. And we, the church, can actually help meet those needs. And we could actually work to reduce the amount of violence we're experiencing as a country.
Are there warning signs to look for from friends or family members that that may need some mental health help?
Yes, and I will provide this link to you guys so that you can put it in your show notes, so people can pull it up. But there's a great website that the FBI has on preventing mass violence that just goes through all of the signs and indicators that you might need to be aware of, and they break it down based on your role. So as a bystander, meaning like a parent or a peer, versus schools, versus workplace, versus mental health providers, which might often see even more in depth than a bystander was. But like the things to know as a bystander is that mass shooters don't snap. They spend time planning and preparing for attacks. And that is what offers us opportunity for prevention. Most attackers, especially if they're younger, most attackers leak. And they do it by ways like talking about maybe a fixation with guns or a fixation on a particular location that they're thinking about targeting. Sometimes they'll just come right out and say, like, I'm just going to blow this all up. But the idea that the individual is an angry loner is not true. They usually have significant in-person and online interactions. After every attack, the FBI and the Secret Service have specialized social scientists that go and interview people as part of the investigation. And so they collect percentages, like data on how many attackers leak and how many times, like a bystander was like, yeah, they said that, but I didn't know what to do with the information. That's a common thing. Or they said that and I was concerned for them, but I didn't think I should say anything. I wanted to protect that person's privacy, or I didn't want to get my kid in trouble. And so there's multiple things we need to do at the bystander, educating them on those signs and behaviors, but also reducing the barriers to reporting, because there is a perception that if you report on your kid, it's scary to think that law enforcement might show up at your door. And so there is a need for us to kind of frame this as, this isn't a punitive action. When you're reporting on your concerns, what you're doing is then accessing people that are trained to be able to assess effectively. And a lot of times those assessments don't suggest a high likelihood of violence risk. And the answer might just be like, yeah, this person's having trouble, but get them a mentor, get them maybe put them into counseling. Parents, you might need this additional help on how you do this better. But it's not always going to end up with somebody in handcuffs. Handcuffs is the last resort when we can't, when we know they've crossed a criminal threshold and we can't move them off that pathway. But other concerning behaviors, jokes or threats about violent plans, repeated or detailed fantasies about violence, comments about hurting themselves or others, creating any sort of documentation, videos, suicide notes, something that might explain or claim credit for future violence. That would be one of those last warning signs that you would probably call law enforcement at that stage, just because that's indicative of near-term action. But some of the earlier signs might be unusual difficulty coping with stress, reduced interest in hobbies, their school or their work, kind of all of a sudden becoming really isolated, angry outbursts or physical aggression, trouble interacting with others, obsessive interest in prior attackers or attacks. This is one that is particularly for parents. You should be, I'm a believer that until they're out of your house, you have full access to their internet history, and you should be checking what sites are they spending time on. There are some nasty sites out there, and my team at Moonshot studies these. We spend time on these. There have been a number of contagion attacks, especially school shooting contagion attacks over the last 2 years, coming from these gore sites or true crime community sites. So if your kid is spending time on those, time for a talk, time to block those sites, and then get that child into to see a mental health professional, because they've been exposed to some really disgusting stuff that's going to mess with their minds. But those are some of the examples. And you see there's a spectrum, right? Like sometimes people have angry outbursts and they just aren't coping well with life. That doesn't mean they're going to go commit an act of violence, but it does mean they need help. And so just because you observe a behavior on that list doesn't mean that you've got the next school shooter on your hands, but it does mean that person is saying, I need help. And what a bystander can do, depending on your role, is just raise the warning flag to somebody who can intervene. So if you're a student in a school, maybe you're going to the school counselor or to a trusted adult and saying, I'm really concerned about my friend. Here's what I've heard. If you're a parent, you have a lot more agency, but you can also call a mental health professional and get advice as a parent. What should I do to help my kid? Do I need to bring them in? Some schools have threat assessment teams. Some states have threat assessment capability. The state of New York has threat assessment teams across all of their counties. And those are places that you can seek advice from. Like, I don't know what to do. And the whole point of those systems is you have trained professionals who are looking at, they're not making personal assessments. They're looking at behavior. They're comparing it to what we know about the data. They're making an assessment about the level of risk the individual poses. And then they're making a management plan. Okay, what can we do to help this person? That's the entire point of doing threat assessment, is to get to the stage of, here's how we treat this, here's how we address this, to move them off the pathway of violence. So if you have those resources in your communities, you should definitely take advantage of it. One of the things, Knapp, as you know, that I've been advocating for the last 5 years since leaving government, is that we need every state to have this capability. And unfortunately, the federal government has cut funding and the programs designed to help the states to build this capability. So it really is kind of up to states individually to decide whether or not they're going to build out this capacity, this non-law enforcement-led approach to help people who might be on the pathway to violence.
Elizabeth Neumann, thanks for helping us understand better, what's going on in these perilous times. I didn't mention your book is Kingdom of Rage. I didn't mention that at the beginning of the podcast, but you actually have the honor of being our first repeat guest on the American Values Coalition podcast.
Oh, that's fun.
If you want to learn more about her book, Kingdom of Rage, we did a previous podcast on that, and so I'll link to that as well. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Knapp.